Awesome. Thank you, Judith. Hello, everyone. Excited to be here moderating this panel. Excited to get us started. As Judith said, my name is Angie Brice Thomas. I'm the founder and CEO of Brice Consulting Group. We are a firm here in the city that focuses on helping organizations advance their commitment to diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion. If you're a museum and Museum Mile in New York City, you probably have worked together. It's a privilege to be here again. I would imagine you've all gotten a chance to skim the panelists' bios, but I'm going to give you a bit of color in each of our folks today. Two who are joining us right here in person, and we have two more on the Zoom. We are joined by Adam Rizzo. Just do a nice wave when I say your name. He's a museum educator from the Philadelphia Museum of Art. He's also president of the local unions group there. We also have Elsa Hiltner, who is a pay equity organizer and co-founder of On Our Team. She began her career as a theatrical custom designer and experienced quite a bit of pay inequity. And so now that she's an administrator, she has a lot to say around how do we move the needle in a meaningful way. And on the Zoom, we have Rachel Adam. Wave, Rachel, great. She's the chief curator and director of programs at Bemis Center for Contemporary Art. She's a self-described extrovert who loves to connect people. And so she's given quite a bit of thought on how do we evolve the work week. And last but not least, we have Mia Locks, who is an independent curator based in Los Angeles, and she's the head of strategy for museums moving forward. And her work is very focused on how do we address organizational culture in the spirit of advancing equity. And so why am I moderating this panel? Given the work that I do on the DEI front, I would imagine that the past 2 years, we've had a lot of conversation across many museums across the city, but also this country. And so there's been a lot of front row discussions that we've all been in around like, how do we, advance pay equity? How do we rectify the work week? How do we ensure that organizational culture is front and center to our conversations? And I would imagine that many of you have been in those conversations at your respective institutions. So I'm excited to be joined by these distinct panelists. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. My first question, this is actually for everyone, would love to hear, tell us a bit about how you got involved into your own space and how does it connect to the art world?
So I'm Elsa. I'm really great to be here. I started as a theatrical costume designer and really experienced a lot of pay inequity being in the area that's most dominated by women and is also the most diverse in theater design. And so working as a white woman, as an able-bodied cis straight white woman, and seeing how I was paid less than other designers on the team and being on teams where all the women were paid less. And so really seeing the systemic nature of why the industry and why the arts are designed like this, and wanting to not just use, individual tactics to make change, but really address the issue systemically. And just a little brief thing on pay equity. Pay equity is really about determining compensation without bias. And so when you think about pay and compensation, you want to think of it very holistically, not within different departments, within the whole organization, not within union or non-union workers. It's all arts workers who are working in the organization. And also thinking holistically about pay as far as what types of compensation, paid time off, wages, those sorts of things.
Thank you, everyone, for inviting me. Thank you. I'm really excited to be here. I would say the thing that got me started down this path, and this might be true for some of you in this room, was the Art Museum Transparency Salary Spreadsheet. When that came out, I remember the morning it came across my desk. I was scandalized by it. I think I'd internalized this idea that we don't talk about money, that we do this work because there's some inherent value and prestige associated with the work. And when that spreadsheet came out, I was initially scared to participate. And I went to one of my coworkers and I was like, can we get in trouble for sharing our information? Which of course you can't. So I then participated. I added my information, and other people in my museum at the Philadelphia Museum of Art did the same, and across the country. And like Elsa was alluding to, immediately it became clear to me that there were wild inequities within my institution, but also across institutions. For instance, there was one woman who was working in my department who had been there longer than me, had just had more experience than I did in museum education, was making $7,000 a year less than me. And I can only think that the reason is because of, I'm a cis white man. And so that was really powerful to see all of that data all at once. And, I would say when I started the museum, I had interviewed over the course of months. I was coming from an academic background where I was doing the adjunct hustle here in New York. And so when I was interviewing over the course of the months, salary didn't come up once in my, 3 interviews. And so when the offer was made to me, I remember the person who hired me prefaced the offer by saying, I know it's not a lot, but we don't do this for the money. And then said, and we're offering you $40,000 a year. And I didn't even think, I just said yes. Like I'd been hustling so hard. I was like, of course, there's 100 people in line behind me who would do this job for free. So that was really kind of what got me fired up and thinking about ways to change institutional culture. And the way we went about it, the PMA, was through unionization.
And Adam, I have the definitions on the screen, and Elsa described pay equity. Tell us about unionization and how does the process get started?
It's a tough process. It's a long process. But, when you unionize, you're basically agreeing with your coworkers to collectively bargain for, improvements in your workplace, whether that's pay or any other kind of issues that you may want to address within institutional culture. It's a years-long process to organize your workers. We won our election about 2 years ago. We were the first wall-to-wall union at a major museum, and that means we represent folks working in basically every department in the museum, from visitor services to curatorial to retail to education to the registrar's office. And so you have to collect authorization cards, and then you go to a vote. And then when you win your vote, then you start negotiating. And we're 20 months into negotiations right now with management. So it's a long haul, but I think it's worth it.
Thank you. Rachel and Mia, over to you two.
Do you want to?
We're doing the Zoom stare. Rachel can go, and then Mia.
So I worked as a curator in museums in New York and Los Angeles for nearly 12 years. And I feel incredibly grateful for the opportunities that I had. But I also started to realize more and more as I moved up the ladder as institutions that there was more to make the personal level just beyond exhibitions. So I don't feel that there's no powerful man. I'm actually working on some independent projects at the moment, but I can just say that I decided to leave my job as a museum curator because I saw serious structural issues. And ultimately, I was in such a position. So, in short, it was an organizational culture for me. I know that I would say that I'm the person who's finest, but I would share that I define organizational culture as a set of shared values, both explicit and implicit, that govern the way that we behave. And at the time that I left my position a year ago, I had fortunately been organizing a group around these area issues and other related issues, I think, other obstacles to equity in museums. And so I was able to shift my energy and spend more time helping museums moving forward, which I co-lead with other women who are all museum curators. And just briefly, MMF is a data-driven effort to support culture shift in organizational policy in our business sector. So we've been working together since 2018, and it's a cross-institutional, intergenerational group, and it's grown to about 100 current and former museum professionals working, I think, 35 or 40 cities across the U.S. And MMF is really dedicated to just leveraging one, basically better understand the state of the field, supposed to actually, models for change, and two, to establish a actual scalable platform for change that can be applied system-wide. So that's sort of how I ended up both doing tutorial and shifting to more of these issues, which actually dovetail a lot with what Elsa and Adam have already shared. But I'll leave it there and just pass it to Rachel.
Thanks, Mia. Hi, everyone. Nice to virtually be here from Omaha, Nebraska. Sorry I couldn't be there in person. And thank you to Angie and to AMC for organizing this. So I'm sort of coming from a little bit of a, more, what's the word I'm looking for now? Monday morning. Just sort of a different kind of place. I am the Chief Curator and Director of Programs at the Bemis Center in Omaha, which is a contemporary art center that has an international artist residency. And so kind of coming into this panel and thinking about ideas of workplace flexibility, which is sort of what I've been thinking about personally a lot. I would say since even before moving to Omaha in 2018, being in Buffalo, working at a university, becoming a mom, really thinking about, what the organization that I was working at the time looked like, which was basically one curator who was doing all of the work of like possibly 2 or 3 curators, plus the communications job, plus the grant writing, plus all of those other things, and knowing like my schedule was just really unsustainable. Moving to another institution that actually physically houses people and has them there 24 hours a day, and really thinking about the team that I now oversee and how we are constantly sort of negotiating hospitality with those people, as well as people that are just coming in through the front doors on Saturdays and Sundays when we're open or when we're having events. So I've been really trying to focus on this idea of flexibility within the workplace and thinking about what that means, shifting to things like a 4-day work week or a 4-5 month, or, really being able to basically like have those, full 2 days off every weekend, which I actually don't have for the next 6 weeks straight because of events. So wanting to kind of think about that. So sort of in terms of defining it, looking at workplace flexibility is sort of creating a culture of respect, really like looking at your team and respecting their time as well as your own time, and really not, sort of jumping into, oh, it's 10 p.m. on Thursday night, I need to text this right now, or I need to answer this email right now, because people need to have it tomorrow morning when they, when they wake up. And it's like, just, being respectful within this culture that we're in that is very programmatically event-based, and that obviously things are happening at all hours of the day. So
thank you, Rachel. This next question. So, these 4 topics are pretty meaty and they're big and they're going to require a lot of lift. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts and help us understand the truth and the hope of the matter. What makes this very challenging to undertake, and what gives you all confidence that we can actually move the needle in a meaningful way?
So I wanted to start with a quote that's from a UNESCO study from 2019 about the arts industry. This is paraphrased, but the largest subsidy of the arts is not foundations or donations or entrance fees. It's the unpaid and underpaid labor of arts workers. And that to me really shows the enormity of the issue and how deep it is and how widespread it is, and really speaks to the challenge of, what we're up against when we're trying to shift all of this. And so in my work, the figuring out what the challenge is and really distilling those down to individual actions that can be addressed with tools is very important. So in research and interviews that I've done, the main barriers have been that there's no models that other organizations can look at to see what others are doing and what might work for their structure and their size. There's no roadmap of how to make this happen. And there's no real culture of celebrating movement forward, even if it's not the end result. You know, a lot of organizations are worried about starting this work, bringing up pay equity, and then being called out for past bad behavior, being called out for not doing enough right now. And at least in the theater industry, social media is very active, and you know, this is a real concern for organizations. And so one of the things that I've been doing on our team is building tools that can directly address these individual barriers. And so we created the pay equity standards, which is kind of based off of the organic and fair trade food labels. It's a checklist that if an organization can go off and check off all those boxes, they get a label that they can put on whatever they want. They can use it for grants. They can use it to draw an audience that might want to see art that aligns with their values. They can use it to gain workers who want to work in an organization that is transparent and equitable. And so I find a lot of hope with the conversations that this sort of work is starting, the organizations that are working through this process right now, and the way that's growing.
I wanted to jump in here and also talk about, a few things that I've been thinking about. And I'm going to just sort of preface this by the fact that Bemis is not, outwardly doing any of these things right now. This is more of a personal interest of mine that I'm hoping to then, further converse with people and distill. But I really like what you said, Elsa, is that the fact that there are not a lot of roadmaps, if any. I would say in the for-profit world, there's definitely more roadmaps for some things like a 4-day work week, or sort of, a shortened work week, things like that. I mean, at Bemis, we have more of a flexible, comp time that we always tell each other that we need to take. And that has been something as a manager, I've been sort of really trying to instill in the people that I oversee, like, hey, you were here until 11 o'clock on Friday night. Like, you need to take, your hours next week. Let's find a time to do that. It doesn't come out of your PTO, right? Like those kinds of aspects of things. But really looking at, places like Kickstarter that just launched their 4-day work week, and talking with John Leland over there, who is sort of heading that and heading also their unionization at Kickstarter, and thinking about, how can we work smarter? How can we sort of identify what we have been doing, and how can we distill that down, maybe an extra 5 or 8 hours every week, get rid of sort of that, I hate to say this, like sort of extra, but that is kind of part of what things you have to do in order to have this more flexibility and have more time for things that we want to pursue. Like, we all want to actually go to maybe museums by ourselves to see art, right? Like, we want to have that day to do that. And so how can we focus on that? So not having those roadmaps can be difficult, but seeing now a shift in culture with for-profits, especially tech industry, but also some nonprofits like Deweyville College in Buffalo is doing it right now, and sort of, being able to kind of reach out to them and talk to them about how their process is going, and testing it, I think, is also important. So.
Rachel, I just appreciate you naming how Bemis is not necessarily there right now, just acknowledging that many of us may have like the aspiration or the intent, but we're not quite there. And I also appreciate you naming places where it is happening, like in academia, Deweyville College, or Kickstarter. Elsa talked about the pay equity standards. This is a plug. If you haven't already, check out the On Our Team website, where they actually have listed the pay equity standards. It's a pretty incredible tool. So I would encourage folks to be thinking about that. Anything anyone else wants to add before I move on? No? All right. So Mia has talked about a lot about organizational culture. And at the end of the day, I think all 4 of these topics connect quite a bit to org culture. So I'd love to hear from each of you. What are the connections between unionization, community building, org culture, workplace flexibility? How do all these things connect to one another?
I can start, I think. I work at a large museum institution. The Philadelphia Museum of Art is, and I think other institutions of the like are also organized in such a way that they're extremely hierarchical, and departments are extremely siloed from each other in the work that happens day to day. And that's a huge, first of all, I don't think that's the most effective organizational structure. When you have departments working kind of in parallel to each other and not really communicating with each other, it creates redundancies, and there's communication breakdowns that happen. One of the biggest challenges in organizing, I had been at the museum for 5 years when I started this work with a few of my colleagues, and the most challenging part was breaking down those silos and getting to know folks in other departments who we had never met before. I work in education, and I didn't know the people who worked in retail. I didn't know folks in conservation. I didn't know even folks in curatorial, which we've spoken a lot or a little bit about earlier yesterday. So really kind of creating those connections was key. And also was a wonderful opportunity to build community within the museum. It's hard to go up to a colleague and say, hey, do you want to grab a cup of coffee? But it's worth it. Even if you're not, organizing, it really changes the workplace culture. And, what we came to discover is that we had far more in common when it came to like our concerns about the workplace, and than was different. So that was the first step for us in organizing. And, in the 3 years I've been doing this work with my wonderful colleagues, I now walk through the museum and know people by name. Like I know the folks in visitor services, I know folks in retail, I know I can say hi to people by name in the hallway. And I think it's always surprising to like my supervisors when they're like, they see me saying hi to folks across the departments, that there are those relationships that have been built. And so I think that's really, really powerful. And important work to do, again, regardless of whether you're unionizing or not. I think it's really important to build those relationships and create more. It's a great way to create more equity and community.
Just to add to that, because I think it's so important that you're talking about the lack of transparency between departments, and that's really structured for a reason, as far as like, pay transparency is not common. What different departments are doing, what they're making is not shared. And that also leads to a lack of collaboration between departments. And so one thing that's really important to me is that pay equity is really good for business, and that it's a clear way to make people within the team feel valued and, on the same footing and better able to collaborate and more connected to the organization. And so people stay at the organization longer. You have that institutional knowledge that stays there. People are more willing to, apply for jobs there. All of these things that really benefit the organization. And one thing that I think people are starting to realize more is that it's also really good for building community outside of the organization, because people want to know how things are made and, how art is, part of their community and how artists and workers are being treated. And so I think that I'm hoping that organizations really understand that showing that is going to help them. And this is also part, just to plug the pay equity standards again, having a symbol that shows patrons or audience members that this is the values of the organization and that they're substantial.
I would add, just thank you, Elsa, you reminded me that like the community that has grown out of the work that we've been doing at the PMA as a group of unionized workers extends to other institutions. We've been working closely with folks who are unionizing across the country at art museums. And so the community is much more expansive than just within our one workplace. And that's also been really powerful. I was just at the Whitney yesterday and talking to the folks wearing union pins who had organized over there. So It's really, I think, much bigger than individual institutions. It's something that whether you're for unions or not, it's something that's happening across this country right now, and it's a really powerful movement.
Rachel, Mia, want to add anything?
Sure. I think that what both of you all said was really great to hear. And I'm just shouting it out there because it reminds me about, also like I work with artists and paying artists fairly, and looking at wage certifications and things like that too. So just putting that plug. But in thinking about, again, like sort of the more flexible workspace and, what that really means, kind of going back to that definition of like respecting your coworkers, right? And that we're all here for a certain job that we're doing, and we're, aiming to do that job, to support our artists that we have, to, be good colleagues, and really like knowing of sort of that sort of work smart, not work harder kind of aspect of life, where of course things are going to come at you from all different angles, but really trying to kind of use tools to figure out how to be smarter about what's coming down, what's coming, in a couple of months, in a couple of weeks, and planning out how to work so that you can all get that time off together. You can all sort of push each other to be like, this is a benefit for all of us. That's sort of what I've been hearing from people. And I think that that's a really smart way to do it, is that it's not just for yourself, it's for your colleagues too. And don't you all want to be sort of, no matter where you are within the organizational structure, supporting each other in that sense. So thinking through that a little bit for me, I think is important to bring up.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about what I can add to all of what's already been said. And I guess I would just, since this is a curators conference, I would just offer some observations. Just, in my time working in art museums over the years, I've noticed a pattern in the organizational cultures, and this is, just building off of a little bit what Adam said. I don't think this is necessarily written down anywhere, but I would say that the hierarchy problem and a lot of these culture issues, I've only been in curatorial departments, but I feel like these are problems that are really pervasive, especially in curatorial departments. They're extremely hierarchical. They're unnecessarily competitive. And if I'm being very honest, I think they're frankly full of very self-centered tendencies. And I don't say this to be like provocative or to be like, unkind to my colleagues. Again, very grateful for everything. And, I've benefited, from a lot of these sort of structural problems, but I think this obsession with curatorial sort of expertise and the professional privileges that come with that sense of curators, being this like, keepers of this special knowledge that can't be shared. Like, I don't know. I mean, for Adam and for Rachel, I know Elsa, you don't work in the sector, although I know we've intersected before, but there's always this like phrase that I hear all the time, which is like, well, we have to run that, through curatorial. And I think in short, I would just say, and maybe this is very obvious, but just to sort of put it out there, like curatorial is really the most privileged of the museum departments. And to me, that means that curators, actually regardless of rank, but curators are actually already in a position of leadership, but they haven't necessarily been trained in that. And I think a lot of times I've seen curators, very well-meaning, really, smart, wonderful colleagues that haven't really given much thought to what it means to be a leader or, how they want to lead. They're just kind of like trying to get their show done. They're trying to, realize their vision or what have you, but that's not the same as leadership to me. That work, that can slip very easily into narcissism. And I guess I'm sort of saying that all to say, like, I think a lot of this stuff I'd like to see. Actually, have you all read this, what is that book called? New Power? People's read that book? Anyway, there's a very good summary. If you haven't read it, you should read it. It's a very good summary of how like the shift in power sort of operates these days. And there's a really good analogy in there about the Tetris tradition versus the Minecraft mindset is how they described it. And I've never played Minecraft, but I think I'm personally interested in learning what younger folks and what actually a lot of the unions and what other sort of allied organizations are already doing and how they're demonstrating what this kind of new power effectively works and how it operates. And I mean, the long and short of it is, and I'm not going to do as good a job as this paraphrasing, but we actually don't need that. We don't have to sort of accept that very top-down, sort of faster and faster logic of the Tetris tradition, that we can and actually are, I think, through self-organized, peer-driven efforts, whether they be unions or just organizers in various capacities. We can just basically create our own versions of things. Like Elsa, you can create you can set your own standards. You can kind of create your own worlds and sort of vibe off of each other. And I guess I'll just say I'd really love to see some of that internalized in curatorial departments.
Thank you, Mia. If you were here, you're all getting some vigorous head nods and the snapping of the hands. And if I just may borrow some sentiments from Dr. Hardy's session, I appreciate just what seems to be like a safe space, but also a space of discomfort, right? We're having some really hard conversations, as we should be, around who has power, who has privilege, and who doesn't. So thank you, Mia, for reminding me of that. And then Elsa, something you said that I think stuck with me is like how the pay equity standards can be this immediate, confers you this badge, right? When you walk into a restaurant, you can understand, is it certifiable? Is it clean? Is it safe for me to eat at? If you're, checking out a university, is it accredited in the ways that I want it to be? So I appreciate how the pay equity standards create just this instantaneous recognition. Adam, I like your shirt. It says museums are not neutral, for anyone who's not seeing it. I do have a follow-up for you. Unionization is a hot topic these days, and it sounds like you're saying, hey, whether or not you wanted it is here, and it's a powerful movement. And having had a front row seat to this over the past couple of years, it can be perceived as a labor of love or a labor of hate. I'm not sure. What's your take on it?
That's a really good question. And I before I answer it directly, I do want to respond briefly to what Mia said as someone who's not in curatorial work, because I really appreciate what kind of Mia was talking about. I think regardless of like what power you feel in your workplace, in your department, there within our institutions, there's a perception of power that you have, and that is in and of itself something. When you think about the kind of role that you can play within the institution, and just as an example, at the PMA, there were about 100 people were laid off during the pandemic. The two departments that were untouched by layoffs and furloughs were curatorial and conservation. So just an interesting kind of fact that I imagine might be true at other institutions as well, though I don't know for sure. To answer your question, a lot of the time folks will I think paint organizers as like agitators, as people who are embittered or angry. And, certainly there's moments of anger and, that can be powerful. But this is work that we're doing. It's a lot of labor outside of work. It's like a second job, to be honest. And many hours given by a huge number of people, and it's because we want the institution to be better, and our collective organizing comes out of a love for the institution and a hope that it can live up to its values. And it's one way to kind of force some accountability on these larger institutions. So I would say that it's very much a labor of love.
Thank you, Adam. My next question, I will say, as a former educator, I think a lot about data and the role it played in my classroom. And hearing each of you speak, it seems like there is a role that data plays in advancing this forward. I'd love to hear, what is your opinion on the role that data plays in shifting or culture and advancing in particular workplace flexibility.
I would love to take that one. I believe that adage, and maybe you guys have heard, I think it's like, you can't change what you don't measure, or the inverse, I guess, which is measure what matters most, you know? And I think we all know that museums have long tracked things like, you know, obviously dollar bills in and out, attendance rates, stuff like that. But I think it's time for museums to measure their organizational cultures, which is trickier and maybe not quite as quantitative, although I'm thinking through some ways that we can actually do that. But I think in that process, and you can measure things like pay equity, you can measure, you know, things like psychological safety, sense of belonging, and specifically gathering some information from those that are experiencing harm. I think that's really one of the key learnings that brings up a lot of fear and anxiety for folks. But just to build off a little bit of what Adam said, I think that, and I actually think this is something that dovetails also just to connect a dot with something that Elsa said earlier about sort of turnover, and how these, like, you know, this is intended to kind of keep things separate and people could just leave if they don't like it. But I think in measuring some of these things, data can be really useful. There was an article recently in, I think it was, what is it called? The MIT Sloan Management Review. The article had like got some traction because it had a good headline that was like toxic cultures driving the Great Resignation, which is like maybe very obvious, but they had some interesting insights into the impact of bad organizational culture and how, you know, unhealthy culture is actually a very, very powerful indicator of turnover. Of course, in the museum sector, so is low pay. And I think there was a survey, it was an AAM study that they did last year, and they found, I think they surveyed like 500 museum workers, and they found that 1 in 5 museum workers don't expect to remain in the field 3 years from now. And I think it was 57, I'm hoping I'm getting these numbers right. My memory is pretty good, but I think it was 57% that cited burnout as the issue, and 59% said low pay is basically going to cause them to change careers. So regardless of the reason, I think it's kind of alarming that 20% of our colleagues think they're going to leave the field. And I think one of the things that I would really like to see is us to start to measure who's leaving, you know, exactly, thinking about it by sort of salary levels or by gender, or race, or age, or what have you, and why are they leaving? You know, how do we keep people? Because the point to me that's important to make is that organizational culture is clearly one of the prime reasons that people are leaving their jobs. But these things, you know, like we talk about psychological safety or you know, sense of belonging, et cetera, these things have an impact not just on the kind of mental and emotional well-being of your staff, of course that too, they also affect your bottom line. You know, turnover is really expensive. You know, the more turnover you have, the lower your morale, which increases turnover, which makes the work slow down. And just to build off of something that Elsa said, like, it's not just that, like, you know, people leave. It's like, people give you their best work when they're in a healthy work environment. You know, people want to be here. They want to, you know, see things, like to Adam's point too, you know, people aren't here because they like, you know, or just like they could make money other ways. They're here because they want to do something. So I think if we can harness that, I think we would all benefit. And I think the outcomes will only improve. So just throw that out there.
I completely agree with you, Mia. And I think that is also sort of something that, you know, that measurement, the measurement of sort of our culture and, you know, how are we spending our time in these places, and what are we doing during that time, and how can we, you know, add to the benefits of the fact that we're giving, I mean, you know, I'm sure everybody on this call and everyone in that auditorium that's there right now is like, just, we've all given so much to our institutions, like personally, physically, you know, and so if we can't get paid more because, you know, for whatever reason, how can we change things a little bit in order to make us, you know, mentally and physically more happy, and really being able to kind of analyze, how am I doing my job? Like, what am I spending my time on? What is actually beneficial to the organization and to me and to the artists and the art that I'm, you know, the communities that I'm working on. And so I think the more that we can measure, the more that we can like survey and talk about these things and, have these conversations both in small groups and also, with our board members, that is also a place of, when talking about privilege, is that like, I know personally, like I have cell phone numbers of board members. I have relationships with board members. Like I can actually have those conversations with them. Not everybody at my organization does, but I also work at a very small organization. I do know everybody's name and all the interns' names because there's 20 of us. So it's a different kind of situation. And I think we can all, as curators, look at, across either to the other curator next to us or to the educator next to us and really like try to have these conversations about, this is going to be really beneficial for all of us and for the organization. So let's, participate in this and figure out how we can make it better.
I just want to say for anybody who has a direct line to their boards or to their leadership, just remind them for that, culture is what drives success. There's a lot of data on this in other sectors, but that's what separates, the kind of great output, it's culture.
Yeah. And also a lot of our board members are very likely business people. So they understand that. So we need to talk to them in their language.
Tell them to pay their staffs better. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Thank you, Mia and Rachel. What I'm hearing you say, two things. One, I like, Mia, how you say we measure what we care about, right? And it sounds like board members, many of whom are business individuals, they do care about data because they know data drive decision, they drive outcomes. So how do we think about speaking and presenting information in the way, in a language that works for them, that they're going to resonate with? My next question. So first, I want to give credit to the institutions within and outside the museum space who've been advancing diversity, equity, accessibility, inclusion prior to the summer of 2020 when George Floyd was murdered. And I also want to name that many of our institutions begun that work or accelerated that work in the summer of 2020. And so a lot of institutions have been talking about this. How do the work that you do and the concepts and the topics that we're talking about relate to DEAI? What's the connection?
Cecile Shellman, who was here yesterday, I don't know if she's here today, but she did some work with the PMA over the past couple of years. And one thing that really stood out to me in the way she talked about at least museums really committing to DEIA work was that one of the hurdles, I think, is that it is essential to actually do this work that power be redistributed. That there needs to be a kind of structural change where there is power sharing. And there's a lot of resistance to that within these very hierarchical institutions. And I see that every day. And, I think that's where the parallel with organizing and unionization exists, because, in organizing and unionizing, you're actually redistributing power by creating a legal contract that management has to adhere to, where they have to agree to give you annual raises. I mean, go imagine that. You can negotiate healthcare, all of these things. So that requires that management really kind of shift the way they think about their relationship to the workers at the institution. One argument that has been made by senior management is that somehow, by having a contract, we're fighting for things like job security. We're fighting for things like opportunities for transfer and promotion. I know a lot of folks at our institutions are in term positions or contracted for only a few years. And so there's so much job precarity there. And we're trying to limit the museum's use of temporary workers, of contract workers, so that there can be more job security, because we believe that those things will increase diversity at the museum, if there are sustainable careers. And sometimes the argument is made is that, like, if management isn't in absolute control of their management decisions, then they can't hire who they want to diversify the museum. And I think that's unfair oversimplification, to say the least. So, you know, I would just say that I think there's lots of overlaps in the type of work that we do organizing the union, and in support of kind of the DIA goals of you know, at least what the museum says their goals are.
Can I just add to that? I appreciate what you're saying, Adam, a lot. And I think we've seen, I think a lot of us have probably already seen, if you haven't, you should check out, you know, the salary surveys and things that have been put out recently. I know AMD has done some good work on this. And we have a sense now, I think it's 72% of museum staffs are white. And I don't say that as like a shameful thing. I just mean like at this point, I feel like having a sense of how white your staff is really only going to take you so far. I think just to build on what you're saying, what we partially need is to actually measure how racially and ethnically diverse your staff is by salary level, how much turnover you're seeing at these different levels, you know, by gender, by race, by age, et cetera. Like we need more demographic data, not just of who's sitting here today, but yeah, to your point, like who just left or who's about to leave or who can't stay because they're you know, not allowed to because of their contract, et cetera, but to start figuring out how to keep people. Because to me, I have heard a lot of people sort of setting these goals to diversify your staff, which is super important. And I really appreciate that. But it doesn't matter how many people you're adding in, you know, if you're adding your BIPOC staff members to your team, if you're not measuring how fast they're leaving, you know, like you can't, what's the metaphor? It's like I don't know, there's like a shipping metaphor I can't think about. But, you know, basically your numbers won't change if you can't keep people. So I do feel like it's important that we measure what's happening to folks once they are in systems and how people are moving through or not moving through an organization. That's the only way we'll get a real picture.
Thank you, Mia. Couple of quick plugs. I just appreciate you leveraging data so much. And if anyone in the audience is like, oh, where did she get that stat? I'd love to get it. Perhaps we can collect all of those and send them to folks toward the end. You mentioned the AMD study and the 72% stat of museum staff being white. Just for those of us who are in New York City might be familiar with this, but we did a set of work. A set of museums in New York City came together this past last year and did a set of work, and we'll actually be presenting at the AM conference later this month. But essentially, if you're interested in like a diversity evaluation tool to help you figure out how do I get from where I'm at to where I want to be it where I'm at being where I'm at, and where I want to be is a census data for my city or for my state. Just want to name, there are tools and resources out there that can be helpful. So I just want to name that, and Nia made me think of that. And then Adam, what I'm also hearing you say is that the work of organizing is actually not antithetical to diversity. In fact, it actually can improve that. So I appreciate you naming that. So it's clear that all of you bring a unique set of lenses to this space. And I would imagine that, you know, many of us in the audience might resonate in different ways to what's being said by each of the four panelists. And as Mia reminded us, this is not just for curators, right? It is for all of us: educators, art handlers, front of house staff, visitor experiences, retail. And I appreciate how Mia named with such candor, but also such grace and humility, how historically we have centered curators at this work. Curators have been considered among the most privileged the art space. And yet, as I hear each of you speak, it sounds like there's a place for all of us at the table, and there's a scenario where all of us can win. I'm curious, how do we win? What's the path toward that?
I'll start with, you know, we all have power within our interactions and within our work. And a lot of this work is being done by very few people, and they're making a lot of change and really a lot of change pretty quickly. And so I think it's really important to recognize your own power. And, you know, for some of us, it might be very obvious what our power is. And for others, you might have to look a little closer to, you know, how you can work with others. But if we can all use our power to further this, you know, move the needle more, make more changes, you know, we'll really start seeing that. And I think too, part of the problem is that we've been steeped in the way the industry is right now for so long that it's really hard to imagine what an alternative could look like and what kind of art would come out of that system and what kind of space would come out of that system. And so I think it's important to remember that and, be actively and creatively imagine and remember that even though the work feels hard, the benefits are huge to everybody involved.
I'm seeing the red flag over here.
Yep. Thank you. I think we're out of time. That means, so thank you all for your attention. We're now going to open it up to Q&A, and I'll let Lucy and Judith direct us to that. When you ask a question, feel free to direct it to the specific, folks can come up to the mic, it sounds like, and feel free to direct it to the specific person you'd like to ask a question of.
I just want to say, Elsa, I feel like that was a great way to end. So thank you.
I have a question for Adam. I feel like a lot of us in this room have cheered as we've seen PMA, Art Institute, MFA Boston, New Museum, MoCA unionize. You also mentioned that it's been 20 months now and you're still negotiating. Can you talk a little bit about what happens after we get to the starting line?
Yeah, so I guess the question is, after you've won, what happens? Yeah, it's a long road. When I can speak to my experience at the PMA, we won our election with an 89% yes vote, and to form a wall-to-wall union. So that means incorporating both what the NLRB considers non-professional and professional workers. Working together and negotiating together. And since then, initially we went into negotiations and it was time to do unit clarification, which is basically, the museum challenged a number of positions that we thought should be in the unit, saying that they were supervisory. And I'm sure a lot of you have experienced, you can't be in the unit if you're supervising workers, if you have hiring or firing power, if you're doing like employee reviews, that type of thing. As I'm sure is true at a lot of institutions, it's true at mine. A lot of people maybe have a title manager, but they don't manage anyone, they manage projects, or they maybe supervise someone for 2 months out of the year, or maybe they just kind of supervise them in name, but the person above them, the department head, is actually the one that they're reporting to. So unit clarification was this process in which the museum basically said that like 40 people who we thought should be in the union were not allowed to be in the union. So we were in negotiations with lawyers for months. I should say also the PMA, like many other institutions, hired an outside law firm, Morgan Lewis and Bacchius, which is a notorious union busting law firm, to represent them at the bargaining table. And that's not uncommon for other museums that I'm aware of. Once the unit clarification was done, which took a couple of months, then we started meeting at the bargaining table. You start with non-economic issues where you're kind of working on, what's supposed to be simple, things like seniority, things like transfer and promotion, health and safety, and what have you. And then once that's done, you move to the economic proposals, and that's where we're at now. So we've presented our entire economic package to the museum management, which they have countered in a way that was not acceptable to us, and we've countered back. So this is a continuing process that I'm hoping will be wrapped up sometime by the summer. Usually first contracts, which are the hardest to negotiate because you're really building a contract from the ground up, take anywhere from like a year and a half to 2 years to come to completion.
I'm asking from over here. A follow-up for Adam. What can you share with us about the role curators played, active or passive, in the union organization in Philadelphia or from other institutions you're aware of?
That's interesting. one of the best parts about this process for me is that I have, through this work, actually begun to, I've built relationships with curators that I would not have done otherwise. So curators are very much involved. It may, I think initially it was hardest to get, to break down those silos, I think at first, because there is this perception that curatorial work is, like kind of like at the top of the pyramid, and very specialized in a way that might resist collective collective kind of bargaining and organizing. But I think what is true of the curatorial field is that a lot of y'all, at least I don't know if emerging professionals or even along the line, are on these, are on fellowships and term positions and contract positions, or on soft money or project-based, kind of contracts, and so I think there's a lot of precarity built into that system that is very familiar to other departments in the museum also. And so, kind of recognizing those similarities between departments and having those conversations, a lot of curators have been heavily involved in our organizing. So it was a challenge, I think, initially to kind of open those conversations, but it's something that is certainly a curators are very involved. I'll say, I'll leave it there. And I've seen that at other institutions too.
It looks like there might be questions in the chat box. I'm wondering if someone can help us with those potentially. Not yet. Okay, got it. Go
Anna
for it.
Marie Sawkins, independent curator. I want to ask Elsa, my former neighbor, more about the pay equity standards, and how do you see it actually expanding beyond theater and then including the arts, and how much buy-in have you had from different organizations, and tell us some stories about the impact.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's nice to see you. So the pay equity standards, for the last 2 years, we've been building it and beta testing it with artists and arts leaders across the country at different theater companies. And then we launched it in January of this year. And so right now it is only for theater companies. And we have about 5 that are working through the process to get certified right now, with many others who are kind of laying the early groundwork to be able to do that next year. And at the same time, I'm working with some arts education organizations to build a second system that's very specific towards them. And the hope is to eventually have, maybe a few different standards that are tailored to different aspects of the industry. And how that works out will be determined as we beta test things and see what is needed in certain sectors and what's not needed in others. But it's also, I think, important that there's very few organizations that are really doing this work right now. And so even organizations who are working to center pay equity maybe are not doing all the steps on the certification, because you need proof that you're talking to your board about living wage in your area, that you have a system so that you can determine pay without bias being, in the background. And so right now we don't have anybody certified, but we do have about 5 that, if everything goes well this fall, they'll be able to certify.
Congrats, it's amazing. 5, go for it.
Jen Mergel in Boston did resign from an institution because of culture, but I want to talk with Mia about measurement. We use a similar phrase, measure what you value, so people value what you measure. And I wanted to bring up HR departments in museums because, and curious what the whole panel thinks on this. I'm thinking about where that measurement that needs to happen can happen in museums, and a lot of people will turn and think, well, the HR department can help you, and yet their interest is still reporting to the director and reporting to the board. So if you had recommendations from MMF of, say, outside resources or things that colleagues could use if they're not getting the support within the museum.
That's a really good question. Hi, Jen. I can't see you, but I'm just going to wave to you. I think that organizational culture and the intersection of organizational culture and HR is really important. And I think that, you know, it's complicated because I guess my instinct is to say, yeah, you know, HR is really challenging. And yes, you know, HR directors do generally report to a director or to somebody else, you know, in leadership if they themselves are not already in leadership. So there is, I think it's fair to say that HR, the function of HR in a lot of ways, unfortunately, although again, this isn't written down, it's not like literally, you know, their job, but it is ultimately, it plays out in such a way that HR departments end up in the position of sort of protecting the institution from any kind of, not even criticism. I mean, that's one thing, but even just opportunities for self-reflection, I would say. And that's really tricky. And I've been through that myself. I've seen a lot of others, and I've heard from a lot of others who really struggle in those moments to either have the courage to speak up because they're afraid either of retribution, which I think is very real, however illegal it might be, but also that they sometimes don't reach out or they don't say anything because they just don't think anything's going to happen. And again, those are the kinds of things that I think are really important to start to get a grip on in terms of numbers, because I hope and think that it could actually help HR departments to better understand how they're doing. And, you know, if folks are, I spoke to an HR, head of an HR, you know, at a museum recently about sort of this question, Jen, of how to measure things and what, you know, what would feel okay to them, what do they want to measure, at the same time talking to staffs about what they'd like to be asked, how they'd like to be, you know, to how to kind of start to bridge that gap. And it kind of never occurred to me, maybe it's obvious, but, you know, the person I was speaking to said to me, you know, I'm a really open person. I have an open door policy. I have a great relationship with my team. So I actually have a lot of, you know, complaints, and I put that in quotes because what constitutes as a complaint, and otherwise it's a very complicated thing. But, you know, basically I hear a lot about what's going on. Folks are mentioning stuff to me about issues that are coming up, big or small. And that's tricky because I also know HR colleagues who were like, what problem? I don't have any problems. No one ever complains about to me. And that doesn't mean that there aren't problems. That might actually mean that they don't trust HR at all and they don't even bother. And so again, how do we start to get a picture of those things is really tricky. And I can maybe talk, there's like more I can say about that, but I would just mention that I know that HR folks also are in dialogue and they have a lot of networks, and there's a lot of, I think, opportunities for growth and learning for HR and for HR to, you know, be more functional within the museum. And I'll also say, just to be on the other side of that, I think there's also sometimes a fundamental misunderstanding about the function of HR on the staff side. And so I think we all need to do a better job of understanding that. And I think the only way we can do that is if we're a little less afraid to talk about these issues. I think discrimination and harassment claims are particularly important because, as folks probably know, there's a long and deep and pervasive culture of non-disclosure agreements around those particular issues. And I'll just say, I think that actually is producing more harm than anything, because for, again, the folks that are experiencing harm or struggling through something and need to leave an organization, you know, due to whatever they're experiencing, I feel like what happens is that everybody goes into like hush hush mode. Everybody, you know, everybody's afraid to kind of, and it's important to protect the people involved, but I also feel like on a collective level, back to the like, how can this help the field? It's really important that we actually learn from each other and learn from the experiences we're seeing, and on all sides, both as institutions and folks that are still inside that want to, you know, improve upon these things, folks that are leaving, folks that are, you know, struggling through these things themselves. So I think the one thing I could say is like, and I'll just say it to this room too, like reach out to people, you know, talk to people. Don't be afraid to say, hey, I'm going through this thing. Like, do you have any advice? Because I think one of the trickiest things for staff that are going through something that they think might need to be brought to HR is that they often feel very alone. And I feel like the aloneness is actually way harder than the thing itself. Yeah, I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah.
Great answer, Mia. An excellent note for us to wrap up. I saw my red card flash up, so we're out of time. But I want to say thank you to Mia, Rachel, Elsa, and Adam, be it the role that data plays in institutions, how we could potentially get to a 4-day work week, to the pay equity standard and the badge, and how union work is a labor of love. Just so appreciate your candor, your grace, and vulnerability. And thank you to the audience as well, both in person and over Zoom. So this concludes our panel. Thanks all.
Thank you.